No. He's coming. He's coming.
Calm down. Help is on the way. As long as he's outside and you're inside, you'll be fine. Describe him to me.
He has a suit on and a tie. He's very tall. He has long arms. He's bald. I'm scared.
Be brave.
Hey there, friends. I have an absolutely chilling tale to share that I discovered in the shadows of Reddit. This is the terrifying true story of a man named John, who committed horrifying acts of violence against his own wife while in a sleepwalking state. John was just your average guy living a normal life with his wife Anne in the suburbs. He worked as an accountant and was generally seen as a gentle, easygoing man by those who knew him. However, John did have a history of occasionally sleepwalking as a child. He never did anything too unusual though, just minor things like waking up on the sofa or raiding the fridge for a midnight snack. As an adult, John thought he had outgrown his sleepwalking habit. But in his late 20s, his sleep patterns started becoming extremely disturbed. Nearly every night, John would have vivid, violent nightmares of being attacked or fighting for his life. He also began waking up in strange, unexpected places with no memory of how he got there. One freezing winter night, John had an especially terrifying nightmare where a shadowy intruder was viciously attacking both him and his wife Anne. John recalled thrashing wildly to fight off the attacker and save Anne. When morning came, John was horrified to discover the horrifying truth. In reality, there had been no intruder. Instead, John had awoken to find himself on top of Anne, with his hands wrapped tightly around her throat. Poor Anne's face was pale blue and she could barely breathe. As Anne gasped for air, John saw the unmistakable marks of his fingers bruised onto her neck. He had no recollection of the attack and was utterly confused. This was only the beginning of John's nocturnal assaults on Anne during his sleepwalking episodes. In the months that followed, Anne was subjected to John's unconscious violence nearly every week. He would squeeze her windpipe until she almost blacked out or climb on top of her, choking her or bashing her head against the headboard. The most terrifying incident was when John picked up a bedside lamp while asleep and smashed it forcefully over Anne's head, cutting her face badly with broken glass. The poor woman felt like she was living with a monster. She became terrified to even sleep in the same room as her own husband. Eventually, Anne forced John to see a sleep specialist, who diagnosed him with REM sleep behavior disorder. This dangerous condition causes people to act out their dreams in a confused state halfway between sleeping and waking. Sufferers have no control over their actions and no memory of what they've done after awakening. For John, the vivid nightmares triggered him to physically lash out and attack his wife against his own conscious will. To stop himself from hurting Anne, he had to start sleeping in a separate room and take medications to prevent the violent outbursts. John hoped this would be enough to control the dangerous disorder that turned him into a sleepwalking attacker. Anne was relieved treatments were finally helping, but still felt uneasy. She knew John wasn't deliberately trying to harm her, but still dreaded possibly becoming the victim of his unwanted assaults again. Their marriage and lives would never be the same. Our next tale of sleepwalking terror tells the story of a man named Bill, who was a loving family man on the surface but harbored a horrifying secret. He was prone to violence while asleep. Bill was known by all his co-workers as a mild-mannered accountant and attentive father of 2 young kids. Everyone spoke highly of Bill and described him as one of the gentlest souls they knew. However, unbeknownst to most, Bill had a history of occasional sleepwalking dating back to childhood. While his sleepwalking was harmless when he was young, it took a disturbing turn later in life. The episodes became dark and violent instead of just innocent midnight snacking. The worst incident happened a few years after Bill married his wife, Jenny, and had kids. One night, Jenny was startled awake by the feeling of someone looming over her. She opened her eyes to the terrifying sight of her husband Bill standing by the bed, wielding a large butcher knife. His eyes were open but glazed over with a disturbing empty stare. Before Jenny could react, Bill began to viciously stab her again and again in a frenzied attack. Jenny's screams couldn't snap Bill out of his state as he stabbed her over 40 times across her chest, arms, and face. Blood sprayed everywhere as she tried desperately to push him away. Miraculously, despite being grievously injured by the dozens of deep puncture wounds, Jenny managed to break free of Bill's attack. She stumbled to the hallway phone and dialed 911 just before losing consciousness. When paramedics arrived, they found Jenny lying in a pool of her own blood, clinging to life by a thread. Meanwhile, Bill was outside wandering the yard in his pajamas, covered in his wife's blood with no idea what was happening. At the hospital, surgeons managed to stabilize Jenny, though she needed hundreds of stitches and blood transfusions to recover from the life-threatening attack. Bill was arrested by police, insisting he had no memory of attacking his wife. At Bill's attempted murder trial, doctors confirmed he suffered from a dangerous parasomnia disorder that causes violence during sleepwalking episodes. His lawyer used this diagnosis to argue Bill was not consciously or willfully in control of his actions that night. In a stunning verdict, the jury found Bill not guilty by reason of his sleep disorder, deeming that he could not be held fully criminally responsible. Jenny was relieved her story was believed, but still lived in fear knowing Bill could randomly attack again while sleeping. Bill swore the incident was a fluke and medication would control his condition. However, Jenny found it harder and harder to sleep next to a man who almost took her life while asleep. She never knew for sure when the peaceful night might turn into a replay of her blood-soaked trauma. This next chilling tale is the story of a 17-year-old named Michael who murdered his own sister while deep in the throes of a sleepwalking nightmare. Michael seemed like your average brooding teenager who liked loud music and keeping to himself. However, his parents had started noticing some concerning changes in his sleeping habits. Michael would toss and turn violently in bed, sometimes even falling onto the floor. He also began having vivid nightmares every night that left him shaking when he woke up. Michael claimed he could never remember the actual dreams, only the lingering terror they induced. His parents chalked it up to stress and tried to provide comfort. One bitterly cold November night, Michael's parents were jerked awake by the sound of blood-curdling screams coming from down the hall. They rushed in a panic to Michael's bedroom, flinging open the door to a scene of horror. Michael was sitting upright in bed, staring blankly at the far wall. At his feet lay the lifeless body of his 12-year-old sister Lily, covered in blood. The poor girl had been viciously stabbed over 24 times with the hunting knife that usually hung on Michael's wall. Michael's mother let out a primal wail at the sight of her slain daughter, while his father desperately checked for a pulse. But Lily was already long gone, having bled out from the frenzy of deep stab wounds across her torso. The commotion finally seemed to snap Michael out of his detached state. He looked around in utter confusion at the nightmarish scene, with no comprehension of how his beloved little sister ended up murdered in his room. When police arrived to arrest Michael for Lily's murder, he continually insisted he had no recollection of committing such a horrific act. Michael claimed he must have savagely slaughtered Lily while asleep in the grips of his chronic nightmares. At the station, Michael broke down crying and told detectives he loved Lily more than anything and would never consciously hurt her. He begged them to believe he was sleepwalking, caught between twisted dreams and reality. The psychiatrists who evaluated Michael confirmed he suffered from a dangerous parasomnia condition, likely triggered by his disrupted sleep patterns and anxiety. They determined it was entirely possible Michael stabbed Lily to death in an unconscious dissociated state brought on by severe sleep deprivation. Though the murder seemed intentional on the surface, Mikhail's lack of motive or any memory of the event suggested otherwise. In the end, a jury found him not criminally liable due to his sleep disorder, but ordered mandatory treatment at a psychiatric facility. Michael's parents were left grieving the loss of their daughter while struggling to understand how their son could gruesomely take Lily's life, without even knowing it himself. They prayed the intensive treatment would prevent any more perils of his perilous sleepwalking condition. Our final tale of homicide committed while sleeping involves a man named Rick, who had a terrifying condition causing him to do the unthinkable to his own wife. Rick had severe sleep apnea, a disorder that mechanically obstructs breathing and drops oxygen levels during sleep. As a result, Rick rarely slept through the night undisturbed. He would wake up choking and gasping for air hundreds of times per night as his airway closed. Rick also experienced exhausting insomnia and vivid, violent nightmares in the brief periods he did sleep. Despite his endless fatigue, Rick tried living a normal life with his wife Jenny. To feel safer in the isolated farmhouse, they kept a handgun in the bedside drawer in case of intruders. One night, after hours of tossing and turning, Rick finally drifted off just before dawn. But his slumber was quickly interrupted by horrific visions of masked intruders attacking him and Jenny in their bedroom. Rick vividly dreamed he grabbed the bedside gun and fired shot after shot to defend Jenny and himself from the imaginary home invaders. The deafening bangs of gunfire jolted Rick awake, drenched in sweat and heart racing, as his nightmare faded. When Rick's adrenaline rush settled, he realized Jenny wasn't in bed next to him. Worried something was wrong after his terrifying dream, Rick searched the house and made a chilling discovery. Jenny lay dead on the kitchen floor, shot once through the heart with the very real handgun from the bedroom. Rick broke down into panicked sobs over her lifeless body, begging her to wake up. Rick called 911 and admitted through tears that he must have accidentally shot Jenny while enacting his nightmare. However, detectives who arrived had their doubts about the story. For one, Rick displayed an oddly calm demeanor for someone claiming they unintentionally killed their spouse. He also admitted waiting 15 minutes after finding Jenny's corpse before calling for help. At Rick's murder trial, he argued he was sleepwalking and not conscious when he shot his wife during the vivid nightmare. But prosecutors called his explanation ridiculous and said Rick knew exactly what he was doing. In the end, the jury agreed Rick's sleepwalking defense seemed too far-fetched to believe. They ultimately didn't buy his version of events and convicted Rick of first-degree murder, sentencing him to life behind bars. Rick continues to insist it was a terrible accident caused by his lack of oxygen and disturbed sleep. But with no witnesses and a doubtful story, he will likely spend the rest of his days imprisoned for the slaying of his wife.